I was saying something useful before. Something very useful. Wasn't that useful. It was about reading. Oh, yeah. Read stuff. Don't just say, okay, I read this thing. This is the best way to do stuff. Read Eric's stuff. Try it out. See what you think. See how it feels. And move on. If you don't agree, that's fine. I think that's one thing that starts, stay off Hacker News. Pretty much. Read something and then try to analyze it. That's all I had for filler. That was it. That was all I could think of to say. I think this part's probably going to get edited out in the audio version. What do you think? Yeah, I think it's also going to get edited out in the audio version.
Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, episode 49. That's right, we are getting remarkably close to 50. I'm your host this week, Danny Blue. No Eric today, just little old me. But I do have a very special guest with me this week, Eric Elliott.
Yeah, you got one Eric today.
All right. So for those of you that don't know, Eric, give us your spiel. Who are you? Who are you, and what do you like?
Sure. I am a JavaScript specialist. I write apps in JavaScript. Well, I say I'm a JavaScript specialist, but I'm really an app specialist. And I've been writing apps since before JavaScript was invented. Started when I was about 5, 6, maybe. I was just learning to read and write, and eventually it became my job, accidentally. I've worked for companies that you've heard of, like Adobe, Zumba Fitness, and I've written code that's used by a lot of companies that you've also heard of. So I've written like user experiences for a lot of bands, about 500,000 bands, many of which you know well, Metallica, Usher, people like that, Frank Ocean, a whole lot of others. I have also worked on a social video app that's used by a lot of the media, like the BBC, CBS, ESPN, Wall Street Journal, and a whole host of others. And I've spent probably the last 5 years or so really focusing on hard on helping teach other people JavaScript, because for that time I've been trying to hire people actively, and I realized that there's a huge skills gap. The number of people that know how to write JavaScript apps is nowhere near the number of people we're trying to hire to write JavaScript apps. So I've been focusing hard on education and trying to make sure that we have enough talent to fill those gaps. And in recent times, I started classes online called Learn JavaScript with Eric Elliott. And one of the first things that we decided, me and my wife, was that we're going to make the classes available for free to Housing First training programs for the homeless. So we spent quite a bit of time on outreach and education about the problem of homelessness, and just raising awareness about the issue, and also working with leaders in the Housing First movement, and trying to make sure that these programs can become available to some of the bigger training programs for the Housing First movement. So that's kind of what I'm all about.
That all sounds pretty great. I do think you are currently the winner for the person who has volunteered that they've started the earliest with JavaScript, like 5 or 6. Like I think Eisenberg was pretty close from Aurelia, but 5 or 6 is pretty early. How did you like?
So it wasn't JavaScript at 5 or 6. That was long before JavaScript was invented. Um, I had a friend just down the street from me who had a whole bunch of computers in basically a computer playroom, and I spent a long time a lot of time playing games over there, and eventually I just wanted to figure out how to write my own. So uh, um, I got some books that were written for kids to help teach programming. Back in those days, all the computers basically booted up into a basic environment. So programming was kind of a natural user interface for computers back then. Now it's still there. Like, it's really easy to pull up a JavaScript console and start to code, but back then you were literally dumped into a programming environment right at boot up time. Um, so that's why I felt like, hey, this is just how you use computers, right? You program them. So I started making my own text adventure games, and I made a bunch of those until I was probably 14, something like that. Then I started branching out to other things a little bit.
Yeah, no, that's really really cool. That seems to be the story for a lot of people. That it starts with games of some kind. Like you play games and then you want to be able to make your own games. That's very very cool.
Yeah, yeah. I hope we can continue to draw kids in that way. In fact, one of the programs that we're working on is a documentary film called Programming Literacy, and it's all about getting kids educated and teaching programming in schools. And a lot of what they're doing, like, there's some really cool programs for little kids. Like, we went and we saw a really cool robot soccer tournament in Seattle, where these bunch of students were building robots and they played soccer. They like had balls out on the court, and the robots were kicking the balls around and pushing them. Really, they didn't really kick. They had wheels, and they had little things that would lift the ball and carry, and then it was pretty cool. Pretty cool. That's a really exciting way to get kids involved in programming, is through fun things like games or robots or things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And things like the Raspberry Pi coming out, and I actually think they're coming out with like a new BBC Micro or something like that they're going to just start giving away to kids in the UK. I heard at some point something like that.
I don't know the specifics, but I heard about the BBC Micro, and I was really excited about that. There are a lot of other programs that are really cool too. In fact, Google recently announced that it's a computer just like the Chromecast. It's a little stick that you just plug into any HDMI capable TV or monitor, and it's the little stick is the computer. So it gives you basically the equivalent of a Chromebook on whatever screen you plug it into. So the availability of stuff like that to get kids involved and to be able to give to, like, it doesn't cost much to give a computer to somebody these days. So just options like that make programming so inexpensive and accessible are phenomenal. In fact, I think one of the hottest places for innovation right now is in like third world Africa, but they're still innovating on technology and coming up with really creative, interesting solutions. In fact, the third world has a lot of cell phones. They're not the fanciest cell phones, but they've got a huge market penetration with cell phones compared to other kinds of technology. And I think the real power is that these inexpensive technologies are becoming ubiquitous, so everybody has access to them. So I just want to make sure that that's the case in our classrooms too. So that's what drives me to be a host in that movie.
Yeah.
JS Cheerleader's producing that. JS_cheerleader on Twitter.
Yeah, and we'll make sure that we put we'll try to grab links to all that stuff as well, so we can stick it in the show notes. That is really, really cool. So you said that one of the reasons you started doing a lot of this stuff is you were trying to hire people, right? Like you were trying to pay somebody money so that they would write code for you.
Yes.
And you were having a hard time finding those people. So is that
Yeah.
kind of where it came from? Like, I can't find the people, so I guess I'm going to have to teach them how to do it.
Yeah, pretty much. Actually, that's exactly how it started. While I was at Zumba, I was basically writing. I spent a lot of time writing training materials to get the other developers on the team up to speed on how to write JavaScript that doesn't fall apart and have a ton of bugs. And that's the kind of JavaScript that was being written there before I got there. So my main responsibility was to clean up that code base, and that was no small feat. Zumba, ostensibly they're a company that teaches people how to get fit by dancing, but in their operations, they're really a technology company. They've built their own shopping cart, and they've got a bunch of custom software that runs for their instructors and for people searching for courses, and almost all of their revenue comes in through their technologies. So it was not a small project to get the front end somewhat bug free. So I spent a lot of time doing cleanup and educating the other developers about how to write better JavaScript. And that really inspired the book. I thought, this really needs to be a book that everybody has access to. So it was less than a year later, I started writing programming JavaScript applications, which was picked up immediately by O'Reilly. They were the first and only publisher that I went to with the book proposal, and they snapped it up right away. So obviously there was a demand for that kind of book. There's still a desperate need for people to read those kinds of books. Mine is not the only one on the market anymore. There's a couple of others that are pretty good, but it's definitely something that's, I would say, since I started writing the book, the gap has got bigger, not smaller. So just because the demand is growing so fast.
Yes, that's kind of what I wanted to ask as well. Is this exclusively a problem with JavaScript, or is it more a problem with JavaScript developers than, say, .NET developers or Java developers?
I think the only reason that it really stands out in JavaScript, well, actually, there's a couple of reasons. The first reason that it really stands out in JavaScript is that JavaScript is the most popular programming language in the world and the most in demand in the marketplace. So that's where we feel it the most. But JavaScript also has a problem where a lot of the developers who were trained in other languages have a hard time grasping JavaScript because they expect it to be harder than it really is. And what I mean by that is that a lot of them come to JavaScript with the idea that you should be using classes and classical inheritance, and that's really not the best way to do programming in any language, but in some languages it's the only way to get going, so you actually have to build abstractions on top of that. In JavaScript, we eliminate the need for classes and the abstractions on top of classes to make composition easier, and you can just do composition in JavaScript and not build class hierarchies. But I end up untraining a lot of bad habits when I'm training new developers in JavaScript. So I think that primarily is one of the biggest challenges. Another major challenge is that a lot of other languages are very procedural. And in JavaScript, it really works best if you can mix in a lot of functional programming concepts. So that means using higher order functions and passing functions around to each other and composing functions and making the functions that you write a lot more reusable. And there's too many developers are writing specific functions for specific types of things instead of using really good universal abstractions like lists of items. Just an array of something can abstract something so that you can pass in a function to deal with the specifics of what you're doing, but then use generic like the array extras and functional utilities to do most of the heavy lifting. So I think there's a serious lack of understanding about what functional programming is and how to use it. And that's not just a problem in JavaScript, but it really stands out in JavaScript because there are so many people who've never been exposed to functional programming before writing JavaScript code.
Yeah, functional programming is definitely, it feels different is a really good way to put it. It's something that's kind of difficult to put your hand on. Like you can point out certain things that it doesn't have, like classes and things like that, but it is different. I do recommend that if anybody is interested in it, specifically with JavaScript, there's something called Node School where you can install it's a Node program, but then you run through a set of tutorials, and then it gives you a problem and you try to solve it. And they have a bunch of different ones, but they have one specifically about functional programming. So they specifically cool. Yeah, so like it's actually pretty good. And Node School like to also be like check to see if you have any local meetups. I know there's one here in my neck of the woods, actually right outside of where I work in Arlington, Virginia. But we'll just look together at that kind of stuff, and the instructions will specifically call out things like do not iterate over this list. So they try to make you do things.
Yeah. So there's another really great training resource for functional programming, and that is Jafar Hussain from Netflix. They use functional programming a lot there, and they've built up a team that really knows their stuff. Jafar himself is on the TC39 committee, and he's trying to help bring us a lot more first-class resources for functional programming to JavaScript as native citizens in the language. So that would be really fantastic. But he built these really great exercises. I forget what they're called, but I can get you a link to share later.
Definitely. Yeah, we actually had him on. We're lucky enough to have him on the show once, talking a lot about some ES6 stuff and just different things, good and bad about it. Things that work. 'Cause I think in that conversation, the idea even came up that if someone were to create JavaScript from scratch now, there might not even be a for operator. It might. So anybody that is curious about more specific things about that can go back and listen to the other episode. If I can ever remember what the number is, I will also post that. But I think it is a fair point that there is also still a problem in some enterprise situations where people will still think that JavaScript is Java Lite or something like that. Like very recently ran into the same thing, and a lot of times it's just no, that's not the case. Please stop doing that. But it can be a problem because it doesn't play as nicely with other concepts as you would want it to. Yeah,
and I think that problem has been exasperated. Is that how you say that word?
Sounds right to me.
I think that problem is worse now with class keyword in ES6. I think a lot of people are going to fall back into their familiar patterns and forget that JavaScript is different. And I think that's a serious problem. And I think it's a much more serious problem than a lot of people seem to realize. There's a lot of people think that I make too big a deal of the dangers of class and classical inheritance, but you got to realize that I come from a background as a consultant. That means that I've been brought in to look at a lot of different code bases, like dozens and dozens of complex apps, and I started doing that before people were building a lot of apps in JavaScript. So I was consulting on on projects in several languages. Like I had a background in C++ and Java, so I saw a lot of Java code bases, and I saw a lot of the problems that can happen. Like I've got a list of those problems in my book, but I saw those problems again and again and again, and I saw the damage that it did to the projects and to the companies. I saw how much money was wasted and how much time was wasted, and the cost is just enormous. I can't overstate the cost, but a lot of people lack that kind of wide experience with lots of different projects and lots of different programmer skill levels leading and running those projects. So a lot of people don't ever see that cost. If you're on a team that has read the Gang of Four book cover to cover many times, and they know that you should favor composition, yes, it is possible to use classes safely. But since it's such a slippery slope and it's so easy for beginners to go down the wrong road and do a lot of damage to code bases, I would follow Doug Crockford's advice, which is if something is sometimes dangerous and there is a better option, then always use the better option. And I think that in the case of class inheritance, there is a better option. And in JavaScript, there are several better options, and they're much, much better. There's no contest whatsoever. I can't think of a single reason to use class inheritance in JavaScript. And I've been issuing a challenge for years and years that has never been answered, at least never been answered with something that I don't have an answer for. And I wrote a whole article on these misconceptions that people try to fire back at me. It's called Common Misconceptions About Inheritance in JavaScript, and it's on the JavaScript Scene blog on Medium. So yeah, just thought I'd get that out there.
Eric, I feel like you might have some opinions about classical inheritance. I don't know, but that's how it's reading a little bit. And if anybody's read any of Eric's stuff, I don't know if I would almost say you're famous for it. I mean, which is great, which is awesome.
Yeah.
One thing. So I want to bring up something in regards to that. So you kind of came up with an answer to that. And I think it came from the first book that you read, which came from the wrote from the experience you talked about that led you to write the book. And that's this library that you wrote called Stamp It. So it sounds like from your experience working at Zumba, which led you to write your first book, out of that book came a library called Stamp It.
Yes. So because of the problems that I encountered with classical inheritance and some more reinforcement on the job, when Backbone came out and people started using Backbone a lot and using the inheritance mechanism built into it, because of those things, I was driven to ask the question, what can we do to make prototypal inheritance easier and more understandable and more flexible? So I thought to myself, well, what kind of user interface or what kind of API would I want to compose JavaScript objects and or to compose factories? And I came up with Stamp It. I first started experimented with that and got some user feedback, and out of that feedback and my own experience using it, we created Stamp It, which has a much nicer API. In fact, it might be a little bit before the official announcement, but I'm going to say it anyway. Stamp It 2.0 has been released. It is available right now on NPM, and you can start using it. There's a lot of really cool new features in it. I suggest that if you are curious about a better way to create objects and a better way to handle inheritance in JavaScript, you should really check it out. There's also a companion project called React Stamp It, which is a version of Stamp It. Well, it's not a version of Stamp It. It actually uses Stamp It internally, but it's an alternative API for creating stamps that are specifically for React components. And that allows you to build React components without using the class keyword in ES6, but also build components that are really composable. So you can actually take a lot of different components and create a new type of component by combining those different components. That is a particularly powerful thing. It's a really good alternative to using mix-ins, and React has a mix-in mechanism in the React create class method, but create class hasn't been officially deprecated, but it's going that way, and you're encouraged to use the new style, which is that you just kind of create functions and use plain old JavaScript objects. A lot of people are using class, but you don't have to. And stamp it, React stamp it makes it really easy not to, and it gives you a much nicer way of doing things. Stamp it is really convenient. It's addictive. Once you start using it, you'll encounter once in a while a situation where you need inheritance, and stamp it just makes it so easy that it's I don't think I'd like to program without it anymore. Like, it's nice to have in my utility, but mostly I do functional programming, so I don't use it as much as you might think since I'm the author of the library, but I do use it frequently, and I think that a lot of other people would too. A lot of people already are, but a lot more people might appreciate it if they check it out.
Very cool. I do recommend anybody going out and looking at it. It is, especially if you're trying to if you want to know where Eric's head's at with a lot of this stuff, read through the source code of Stamp It, use the library. It's well written, and it's very well maintained as well. So you brought up React, and you've been tweeting quite a bit about React recently, which I'm not going to lie, surprised me a little bit because you've been a big proponent of JSX.
Yes. So originally, I was a big opponent of JSX. I thought it was a terrible idea because it reminded me of PHP, and PHP did it all wrong.
And everyone wants to forget about PHP.
Yeah, mixing tags and markup in PHP was terrible. Maybe it wasn't such a terrible idea now that I've been using JSX, but PHP was a terrible implementation of the idea, and it went very badly. But I probably some PHP fans out there might disagree with me, but I have a pretty strong opinion about it, so they're not going to change my mind. But JSX does a wonderful job of it, and I think the main reason for that is because it's not actually a text templating language. It's really just a declarative representation for JavaScript, and it literally gets compiled into JavaScript. And it's not HTML. It does not correspond one-to-one with HTML. If you try to write HTML in it, you're gonna bump into some awkward situations because the attributes on all the tags are named for the DOM attributes and not for the HTML attributes. So you gotta watch out for that when you're just learning it, and just realize that it corresponds to the DOM and not to HTML, and that should sort you out most of the way. Another really great thing about JSX is because it's actually JavaScript and it has nothing to do with HTML. When you write an event listener, it gets handled as like a special case. They've got kind of a virtual events kind of hooked up, and it takes things like onClick and turns them into a delegate. So it has a delegate listener at the root of the React tree. So that one listener handles every kind of event in that tree. So it automatically delegates all of your events, which means that you don't have to think about how to delegate your events anymore. You don't have to think about like whether or not you're going to listen and switch on different cases, because it does all that for you. It does it automatically. So it basically writes all the really nasty boilerplate that we used to write using other systems. It does that all for you and does it in a very efficient way. Handles it better than I did. And I wrote a book on the topic. So, I think that it's a huge win. I'm using it a lot in my projects now, and I'm loving it so far.
No, that's awesome. Glad that you are using it, I guess. Whatever you can. So like you said, you're a big JavaScript guy, but you're an applications guy, right? You want to write good applications. If something better comes along to help you write better applications, you'll use that.
Yes. Yeah. And I've said before, I can't wait for the replacement for JavaScript to come along. And I don't mean that I'm going to start using C++ or Java again, because I've already been down those roads. I know where they lead. And JavaScript is better for most things than C++ and Java. And a lot of people might disagree with that, but
I think a lot of people might disagree with that. But bold statements from Eric Elliott.
Yeah, I've used them all. And I know what it's like programming in C++ and Java. And I know what it's like from the perspective of somebody who really dove in head first into both of those languages. And I bought all of the marketing lines when I dove into them, or I wouldn't have learned them in the first place. And initially, I loved both languages. Like I thought templates were a fantastic idea in C++. And then I started realizing that I was hacking myself into corners with templates and getting myself in trouble. And in Java, I initially thought the class paths and namespacing as first class stuff in Java was a really good idea for a language that that was going to have applications distributed all over the web. And then I realized much later that there's better ways to handle module namespaces and just use modules and let the npm registry handle namespaces for you. So, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that I like about those languages, but there's a lot of really good reasons that I use JavaScript instead of those languages. Not least because, it was the only way to get first-class DOM access back in the day, but that's definitely not the only reason that I use it now. And I use Node on the server side, and it's not just because I can write stuff in the same language that I do in the browser. A lot of it is also because I happen to be much more effective writing in JavaScript than I ever was in C++ or Java, even at the peak of my abilities in those languages.
No, yeah, like it's not like you're playing. See, me, I just complain about things and don't ever touch them. That's the best. That's the best I can do. You actually have reasons behind things, which is good to hear. So you talked about using. So I do have one note because I have a guy that I work with who wrote Java for a long time and still writes Java, and like I'll get real excited, and be like, hey, there's this really cool thing that we're doing in JavaScript, and he's like, huh. Sounds a lot like the early days of Java. So is there a risk that JavaScript starts, because Java's big tagline was write once, run everywhere, right? And you're starting to see some of those things pop up a little bit in JavaScript. Do you think there's a risk of going that way, or do you think it's being pretty well managed from the standards bodies and such?
I think the potential is there for people to start using it like Java. That potential is not new, but it's definitely a lot more inviting now. It's like the sirens crashing ships on the rocks now that we have a native class keyword. I think that a lot of people will crash on the rocks. And I warned of that a couple of years before they really got serious about bringing class into JavaScript and having implementations. And I warned of that again as they were finalizing the syntax. And the thing about smart people is they're really brilliant. They do a lot of really great work, but they tend to think they already know all of this stuff, and sometimes their minds are closed to input. And I'm including myself in that generalization. I do it a lot too. I think most people do. And they just did not take the warnings seriously, and it got into the JavaScript specification. And I probably made a few enemies while I was arguing against it, because I was arguing pretty loudly, and some might say a little bit bluntly. But yes, a lot of people are going to get into trouble by treating JavaScript like Java, especially now that we've got class as a first-class citizen in the language. However, JavaScript itself will never turn into Java. That's never going to happen. And the reason for that is that there's so much flexibility in the language now, and so much expressivity in the language now, and so many people are addicted to it, that trying to take it away now that people are accustomed to it would not go well. There would be rioting in the streets, and people would try to find the virtual home of the TC39 committee and burn it down. And it's a good thing it's only virtual. It's never going to happen. What is going to happen is that JavaScript is going to get a lot more really great first-class support for more functional features. And like, we've already started to see the beginnings of iterators taking shape in JavaScript. There's actually an iterator API that works in ES6. It's going to get expanded on in ES7, I'm sure, especially with the proponent Jafar Hussain on the committee. I think that he is tremendously good at conveying his opinion and the value of functional programming concepts. And I think that with somebody who is much better at communicating with TC39 than I ever was actually on the committee, I think that there's no chance that JavaScript will ever become another Java. It's going to go two ways. There's a lot of people are going to use it more like Java, and a lot of people are going to use it more like a functional programming language. So its split personality is going to get split even more. But that just underscores the need for people to understand the two pillars of JavaScript: prototypal object-oriented inheritance and functional programming. So I think if people realize that those are two pillars, and if you take one away, JavaScript falls over. I think if they realize that, then everything's going to be fine. I think I completely missed the point of your question.
No, so like that.
I misread it. So I completely missed the write once, run everywhere bit. So absolutely, JavaScript is write once, run everywhere, and it has been for a few years now, and that is never going away. So we're actually getting something called WebAssembly coming pretty soon, and WebAssembly is it's basically a binary protocol for an AST that's very much based on the existing JavaScript AST. In fact, it's going to be it'll be polyfilled with Asm.js, which is a project that makes it easier to compile programs to JS. And a lot of really cool stuff has been compiled to JS using that technology, and are taking advantage of some of those techniques. And those include the Unreal Engine, and you know, there's a couple of really great AAA game platforms that compile to JavaScript, and they use those kinds of techniques. And we're going to get a native WebAssembly language that is, number one, it's a binary. It's not a bytecode. It's an AST base. So yeah, a lot of people are comparing it to a bytecode, but it's not the same thing. So the AST is an abstract syntax tree. And if you are at all familiar with transpilers, a lot of them start by taking all the tokens in the language and transforming them into the AST. And once they've got that syntax tree, then they can process and understand what's going on in the program. So using an AST allows for a lot of really cool optimizations using static analysis techniques and things like that. But another cool thing about the AST is that they can actually compile it smaller than they could a bytecode. So because they have that abstract syntax representation of the program instead of just the raw instructions, they can look for opportunities to cut out unused bits of the program and do all kinds of crazy optimizations, so they can actually make it smaller than they could with a bytecode. So I think it's really cool. It's a binary protocol or binary format, like I mentioned, which means that it starts out a lot smaller in file size than the text version of the same thing. And once you compile it with, or not compile it, but compress it with gzip, it gets even smaller. So it's a fraction of the size. Like if you're taking a great big program and compiling it, you'll save a lot of space by compiling it to the WebAssembly format. So it's pretty cool. A lot of people have been worried that giving people an assembly language for the web with first-class access to all of the web browser APIs and everything is dangerous because it unseats JavaScript as the only language with first-class native access in the browser. It's definitely not going to replace JavaScript. You know, JavaScript didn't need an exclusive dominant position on the server side to take over. It just happened to be better at doing the things that people were already doing in C++ and Java and Scala and all these other languages. For example, Ruby. Ruby was designed specifically for, or Ruby on Rails, rather, was designed specifically for building web applications. But V8 did it much, much better. And the reason that V8 did it better is because, number one, the V8 engine is really, really highly optimized for performance. The Ruby engine is really, really highly optimized to make a developer's life convenient. And that's a big difference. I think it's really important to consider the developers and to make their work as efficient as possible, which is why I'm so excited about all the new syntax in ES6. But I also think it's really, really important to optimize the engine as much as possible. And you know, when I was doing porting programs from Ruby to JavaScript, and I did several of those with large projects, one of the things that I noticed really quickly is that all the tests from Ruby ran much, much faster in JavaScript. And the reason for that is because they could run concurrently in JavaScript, and the Ruby versions were just like firing off requests and waiting around for them to come back. And the only way to get around that in Ruby is to use something called Event Machine. But if you're using Event Machine, then all of the modules that you use, all the Ruby gems you include, have to also be aware that they're running on Event Machine. And they have to be aware that they're not blocking. Well, Node is not blocking by default. And that means that stuff gets out of the way so it can do other things while I/O is processing, like disk access or network access. So I think that built-in concurrency model that is really a first-class citizen in Node makes it a really, really strong competitor against languages like Ruby, which has Event Machine, and even against Python, which is a pretty great language, but you have to use specific stuff that knows about Twisted in order to use or Twisted or Tornado in order to use those effectively. And Node is like, everybody knows that you're supposed to be doing asynchronous by default. Well, almost everybody. We're trying to educate the newbies that come along and do blocking calls. But for the most part, any library that you're using for Node is not going to use blocking calls in the request response process. So yeah, there were already really great options, and JavaScript still won, right? So I want to be very clear. JavaScript is not popular just because there are no other choices. JavaScript is popular because it's really well suited to the job that it does, which is being a really great high-level general purpose language for writing things like app logic and user interface code and web servers. And it's going to remain very, very strong and very, very competitive in those fields for the foreseeable future. And frankly, I don't see any other languages out there at this point that can really compete. But I would love to see that happen. And I like the fact that it is an option that another language could come along and beat JavaScript at JavaScript's own game. And if that happens, I'll be the first person in line applauding at the front and saying and cheering them on and saying, yes, we need this, right? Language diversity is not a bad thing, right? When I got my first programming job, I had already programmed in something like 17 different programming languages. And I think that it's very important to learn at least 3 well enough that you can write decent applications in them. And the reason that I say that is because exposing yourself to other languages also exposes yourself to other ways of thinking about the world and thinking about the problems that you're working on. And that can strengthen your understanding of that problem in your language of choice. So having other languages available to the web platform is only going to be good news. It's only good news for everybody. And everybody who's worried that the sky is falling, you can relax. The sky is not falling. JavaScript isn't going anywhere. It's a rocket ship. There's no slowing down its momentum for the foreseeable future. And the polyfill for ASM is going to be around for a long time, or it's going to be around pretty quickly. But the actual first-class browser support for WebAssembly is still a little ways off. You've got a couple of years to chill and not worry about anything and just enjoy your JavaScript, because ASM.js has not even begun to make a dent in JavaScript becoming more and more popular, and compiling to it as a polyfill option is definitely not going to make any more dent than we already have made, which is none at all, so you're safe.
But I would say that it's a very good point. People panic when new things happen, and sometimes they don't know exactly how to do it.
Yeah, a lot of people panicked. The Register had a headline that said that Brendan Eich is trying to kill JavaScript. Kill, all capital letters in the headline. That could not be further from the truth. Brendan Eich is still a huge proponent of JavaScript, and he's very supportive of the language, and he has a lot of confidence that it's going to survive. So I'm amused, honestly, but I'm not laughing at you if you're one of the people panicking. I'm not laughing at you. I'm just amused because like the reality and people's reaction are so on opposite sides of the world.
Awesome. So we are starting to run out of time.
So back in 2008, I had a good creative business. It was really just starting to take off. Really, I'd only been doing it for a couple of years, but I had quickly propelled myself to a really good position in the community, and I had really great brand awareness, and I had a lot of clients, and I was just starting to get some really, really great deals. I had a really good Rolodex, mostly ad agencies and magazines. Those were the two big ones. I also had like books and stuff like that. Licensing things. And in October of 2008, of course, the housing market crashed earlier in 2008. By October, it was really starting to hurt the markets. And there was a blog that was just dedicated to watching all the magazines that were dropping like flies and closing their doors. And I started to see a lot of my clients on that Death Watch blog. And I was calling around trying to figure out what was going on with payments that people owed me, and a lot of my contacts were being laid off from the companies that were surviving. And between October and something like April or early the next year, I had no payments come in from clients. So they literally had stopped paying their bills. And a lot of them had just completely ceased to exist. And then even the companies that were still there, the people that were working on my account weren't at the company anymore. So I ended up with a completely worthless Rolodex. And if you're in the creative industry, that's really scary because it takes time to build that up, and you can't replace it overnight. So I ended up selling my home, and I started couch surfing with friends, and I had no income, zero income. And I was just taking odd jobs where I could get them. And that's kind of where my background was. I got hired eventually to Zumba, and I flew out to Miami and was having fun there for a while. And then I flew to San Francisco for another job. And when I got into San Francisco, it was a really big shock. And the reason for that is because there are literally hundreds of homeless people that I encountered on a daily basis while I was on the commute in the subways and walking from the short distance from the subway to the office building. One day I literally tripped over a guy who had a cardboard box in the middle of the sidewalk because he had no place else to sleep. And it just really just brought it home for me. Like, this is a really serious problem, and somebody really needs to be doing something about this. And giving somebody a $20 bill here and there, or like a box of pizza, it's not going to cut it. So when we decided to host our courses, making that available to the Housing First programs was one of the first things that we decided that we were going to do. And so we reached out to some people in the Housing First community, some of the leading figures in the community, and got some really good advice. We got the opportunity to learn about the job training programs that they were currently using, and a lot of them were things like how to be a landscaper or how to do janitorial work or, things like that. And I was thinking to myself, while I'm hearing about these programs, I'm thinking to myself, those jobs are not going to give you enough money to afford a home in San Francisco or anywhere in the Bay Area. They're just not. You would need to find lots of roommates, because in San Francisco, you literally have to be making a 6-figure income to afford a moderate home inside the city without a ton of roommates, just because the housing market is 3 times more expensive in San Francisco than it is the average in the rest of the United States. So it just seemed ridiculous that these job training programs were training people to be in the same position that they were in before they were homeless, and that is not making enough money to pay their rent. So I really think that it's important that we train them. We don't treat homeless people like second-class citizens. They are real people with real feelings, and they just had a streak of bad luck. A lot of them had serious medical issues that cost them a lot of money. Some of them lost relatives who were paying the bills. People are not homeless because they're too lazy to work. They're homeless because they can't find housing that they can afford. And in the Bay Area, this is especially a big problem. A lot of people who were in the middle class, doing pretty well in the middle class, have been priced out of the market inside San Francisco. And that's why they ended up on the streets. And they just can't afford to get out and find a more affordable place to live, because it costs money to travel even. So it's really a disgusting situation that we have allowed to develop in the San Francisco area, and it's completely inexcusable, and we should all be ashamed. And we should be ashamed that we let this happen, that we haven't been more vocal to the government about cleaning up the situation and cleaning up our streets and giving people safe places to live. It's absolutely a basic necessity in society, and we need to do something about it. So that's what we committed to do. We're fighting to end homelessness, and we're going to keep fighting until it's gone.
That's awesome.
All right.
It's really good to hear. We are running out of time. I can't think of a better way to end. Thank you everybody for listening very much. You can find me on Twitter as always at DE_BLO. And
all right, it's been my pleasure being on the show. I'm glad you invited us. So you can follow me on Twitter _Eric Elliott, 2 T's in Elliott. A lot of people get that wrong. You should also follow JS _cheerleader. Like I said before, she's the director of the movie, the documentary film, Programming Literacy. She's also really amazing as a connector and an opportunity creator for people in the JavaScript community, and she's doing a lot of great work, and you should definitely follow her. And if you want to contribute, reach out to JS Cheerleader. She will hook it up and make sure that that you're contributing in the right place, and that the maximum benefit is going to be, we're going to get the maximum results out of it. So anyway, thanks a lot. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you very, very much. I greatly appreciate it. So I'll see everybody next week.
You want to learn more about what's coming on next on the Web Platform Podcast? Follow us on Twitter at the Web Platform, or on Google Plus and YouTube at the Web Platform. We also need your help in creating transcripts of the episodes and helping to create open source projects under our GitHub organization. Contact Eric Isaacson at eIsaacson,
or Danny Blue at D_Blue. That's DEE_BLOO.
Thank you for listening, everybody, and we'll catch you all next week.